Hi, I'm Mike, and welcome to Red Cell Confidential. This podcast is about using guerrilla tactics to attack social injustice. Now let's get the legal in terms of service stuff out of the way right off the bat. This is not a children's program. The subject matter and my language will occasionally be unsuited for family hour. This is not about inciting violence or planning an armed insurrection. The first case is counterproductive, and the second is just an incredibly stupid fantasy. This podcast is simply about using innovative, practical means to win the hearts and minds of the people in our local communities, which is exactly where social revolutions take root. Now, if you're ready to take action, the kind of action that actually produces results, then stay tuned. Alrighty then. This week we're going to introduce the asymmetrical approach as it applies to organizing when you're alone and deep in enemy territory. Now, a lot of us live in areas where the ruling class is corrupt, powerful, and ruthless. And we're faced with a population that is stubbornly hostile to anything or anyone that smacks of socialism. Generally, decent people that have been deluded into thinking that we, and not the rapacious right-wing demagogues, are out to destroy their country and their way of life. We're going to discuss a different kind of protocol. One that can help us win this war for the hearts and minds of our people, do it with limited resources, and without exposing us to excessive risk of institutional or popular violence. Let's get started. I'm guessing that one day you looked around you and didn't like what you saw. We don't need to go into all the social and economic ills right now. If you're here, then you already have a good idea of what's wrong. You already know that this country, once the bastion of freedom, at least in our American mythology, has become something more dark and frightening and increasingly authoritarian than we ever imagined. So you decided to act. If you're like most of us, that began with finding a political candidate that you thought would represent your interests, at least for the most part. Maybe you got involved, maybe through a political organization. You got out and canvassed neighborhoods, organized transportation to get people to the polls, whatever you could do. Maybe you just sent them money, voted, and hoped for the best. In any case, I'll guarantee you that one of three things happened. 1. They didn't get elected. 2. They got elected but were powerless to push through the promised agenda. 3. They got elected and then betrayed you. That's just the way it goes. Real change, revolutionary change, is never brought about through electoral politics. Never has been, never will be. So what are we to do, huh? Storm the Capitol? Right. Let me paint a picture for you. Think back to all the video clips you saw on January the 6th, 2021. Only this time, instead of MAGA hats and ballistic plate carriers and gas masks and ridiculous shaman costumes with body paint, what I want you to envision is a different crowd. Not an all-white crowd, but one with a lot more diversity. Instead of American flags and right-wing tribal totems, see American flags interspersed with some red or red and black flags. Some folks wearing Black Lives Matter or DSA or even Anacom t-shirts. You can bet your rear end that the National Guard would have been there in record time. The response would have been brutal, the casualties much higher. Instead of being painted as poor deluded fools like the president's friends were, this crowd would have been painted as dangerous, violent, foaming at the mouth traitors to their country. They would have been rounded up and brought to swift justice. And most likely their families would also have been in mortal danger from avenging trumpettes and maggots. Regardless of what you hear from the eat-the-rich lunatic fringe of the left, violent revolutions without the support of the military always fail. And let's face it, a military coup is highly unlikely, for many reasons. No, the only real path to revolutionary change is to build it from the ground up, from getting broad-based popular support for a more equitable and democratic system. In other words, we have to win the hearts and minds of the American people, starting at the grassroots, our own communities. All right, you say, but how do we go about that? Exactly. How do we win their hearts and minds? Well, not by standing on a soapbox, preaching socialist theory, and invoking the names of Marx, Trotsky, or some dead French guys that nobody ever heard of, and certainly not by burning their damn huts down. So, how do we go about that? Well, answering that question is what this podcast is all about. To start, let me tell you a story about something that happened in the CIA some years back. On September 12th, 2011, the day after the infamous terror attack that Americans refer to simply as 9/11, George Tenet, who was then director of the CIA, established a new analytic group focused on countering the agency's institutional groupthink problem. He was charged with giving the agency and its customers a left-of-center, critical view of the world and shaking up the establishment. He gave it the shadowy and alluring name Red Cell. This is the metaphorical predecessor of Red Cell Confidential. We're definitely left of center, critical, and determined to shake up the groupthink in the American left with some outside-the-box ideas from unexpected sources. Our Red Cell approach is to adapt the clandestine techniques of the intelligence agency's field agent, along with the strategy and tactics of the guerrilla fighter, more generally referred to as asymmetrical warfare. The following is a quote extracted from Encyclopedia Britannica. So I quote, "The broad strategy underlying successful guerrilla warfare is that of protracted harassment accomplished by extremely subtle, flexible tactics designed to wear down the enemy. The time gained is necessary either to develop sufficient military strength to defeat the enemy forces in orthodox battle, as did Mao in China, or to subject the enemy to internal and external military and political pressures sufficient to cause him to seek peace favorable to the guerrillas, as the Algerian guerrillas did to France, the Angolan and Mozambican guerrillas to Portugal, and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to the United States." That's one a lot of us remember all too well. And though I don't give total credit to the Viet Cong guerrillas for bringing about the humiliating results of that war, still, you have to give them credit for being a significant factor. To continue the quote, "This strategy embodies political, social, economic, and psychological factors to which the military element is often subordinated, without, however, lessening the ultimate importance of the military role." Unquote. So, while we aren't fighting a shooting war with the government, we are involved in a war for the hearts and minds of the American people. This asymmetrical approach is a tried and true method for a smaller force with fewer resources to win popular support and take on something like the pseudo-democratic government and the military-industrial complex that backs them. Kind of like Goliath on steroids. So, we've been at this for about 10 minutes, and that's about the length of my attention span. I hope this gives you kind of an introduction to what we're all about here and the direction that we're going. In next week's episode, we're going to start with something else that needs to be addressed before we hit the streets, and that's OPSEC. OPSEC is military jargon for operational security, and it's absolutely vital to working with your community in this way. Now, the podcast isn't over, so I hope you'll stick around and join me for the next segment of our show. Welcome back to the second segment of this episode of Red Cell Confidential. In future episodes, I'll be using this part of the program to answer questions, read your comments, share them with everybody else, and especially share any success stories you might send me about how you applied the principles and how they worked out. But for now, I'm just going to try to answer a couple of questions that I think people might have at this point. Okay? Question. Mike, are you absolutely insane? How can you talk about not fomenting violence and not encouraging an armed insurrection in one breath, and then turn around and start talking about covert activities and using guerrilla warfare tactics in the next breath? Well, that's a fair question. And as the episodes go on, you'll start to pick up on the fact that I'm not talking about the direct application of those techniques to our social and economic problems. I'm talking about adapting them to work for us in our communities. Here's an example. Back in Vietnam, the Viet Cong were the guerrillas, and they were up against the United States, the most powerful military force in the world. They didn't have a lot of resources, a lot of money, and at least in the beginning, they weren't getting all that much help from the North Vietnamese regular army. So they used what they had available, and one of their most infamous tricks was digging little pits in the trails and lining the bottoms with punji stakes. Those were sharpened bamboo sticks that would pierce a soldier's foot or lower leg if he stepped in the pit, and they were coated with manure or whatever rotten crap was available to try and give the poor guy an infection when he stepped on them. They were highly effective, and soldiers learned to stay off the trails because, as anybody will tell you, a soldier that can't walk is a liability, not an asset. So, what am I talking about? We're going to go out and dig little pits in the ground and hope that some right-wing neo-Nazi steps on him and pierces his foot? Well, as appealing as that might sound, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Let's take an example and say that you have a deprived neighborhood where there's a lot of poverty and maybe even food shortages going on. So look around. What can you do to alleviate it? What solutions can you find using the resources you have available? Is there a vacant lot? Can the neighborhood put enough money together to rent it? Or can you get it donated? Can you get the community to get together and plant a communal garden and share the food among the people that are having food shortages? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, and I'm talking about doing it without mentioning that, oh, this is basic socialism. This is a commune. No, people aren't into that. But if we can get them doing socialistic things and finding that they work and that they're making their lives better, that is what takes us along the path to winning the hearts and minds of our local communities. And that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Now let's try another. Mike, are you a liberal? Answer, don't ever call me a liberal. Okay, we can wrap up this segment until you guys send me in some intelligent questions and comments and hopefully some good stories as we go along. Thanks for tuning in to Red Cell Confidential. I hope you've learned something from this week's episode. I really hope you get out of your easy chair and take what you've learned to the streets. Remember, it's all just dreams and hot air till you put your boots on the ground and your ideas into action. If you like the show, subscribe, hit the like button. It really will help me keep this thing on the air. And I'd love to hear your questions and comments. You know the routine. I'll be back next week with more guerrilla tactics and outside-the-box ideas about giving power to the powerless. Until next time, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Solidarity.